Okay, welcome. This was an impromptu event. We're talking about the Mattis file. I'm here with Joanne Allen, who, and to my knowledge, you were an administrator at one point of the Bernie Sanders, San Diego Bernie Crats Facebook group in California.
hmm
That from which the story evolved about Russians hacking into the campaign, the Bernie Sanders campaign, even though it's a Facebook group,
hmm
and essentially creating a huge fake news tornado that has engulfed Huffington Post to some extent. The New York Times, I even saw, used John Mattis's accounts. BuzzFeed a bit, even though they did hedge their bets. Um, there was MSNBC, most famous of all, both Ari Melber and especially Rachel Maddow used John Mattis's account. So I'd like to start off there. The reason that I came across this story, I had, obviously I am not, most people know that I am not a Bernie Sanders supporter, especially if you look at my last video from last night. I'm very disappointed in his position on the Russia summit.
hmm
However, when I noticed that he's basically being almost log jammed into condemning his own supporters due to Russian infiltration, I started to realize that there's a pattern where things are it appears that Bernie Sanders is being blamed for activities that have nothing to do with his active campaign and the people that worked for him. And I started to inspect really the statements of the people that were making it. And the person who kept, was the most suspicious was one John C. Mattis, who admitted in an article in Politico in February 2018. He said that he had turned over information about the Russian hacking to the Hillary Clinton campaign, but he didn't say the Hillary Clinton campaign. He said to American Bridge 21st Century. And for those of you that are savvy in the ways of campaign finance, the the American Bridge 21st Century PAC is actually run by David Brock. So, Joanne, I'd like to introduce first your experience. How did you come to be active in the Bernie Sanders campaign?
I have been a longtime supporter of Bernie Sanders, particularly when he was speaking out against Alan Greenspan and a lot of the things that he was doing. Um, he has always been in favor of workers and workers' rights and kind of economic justice issues that nobody else ever really talks about except for perhaps Elizabeth Warren. And when he said, we were always hoping, some of us, that he would run for president. And so when he said he would consider it, we jumped in before he even really officially announced, and we started working on the ground and setting up social media pages and stuff to start working on, because we knew that the biggest obstacle was going to be name recognition. Because unless you're kind of a political geek, most people didn't know who Bernie Sanders was. So we were trying to get his name out to the public. So that's why we tried to get out there as soon as he said he would think about it.
Right.
That's how we.
And did it come to be more of a grassroots community as opposed to a formal campaign? Is that kind of how you experienced it, or was there actually a formal campaign structure in Southern California? You're what is it? It's San Diego County and
No,
what's that?
we had no official contact even really. I mean, we tried to contact his campaign people for materials like donation envelopes and things like that. But as far as any coordination on the ground, his campaign people didn't come here until I believe it was March of 2016. And we were already well on the road, and they actually kind of just integrated with us, and we kind of ran parallel things because we were doing a lot of farmers market, street fairs, stuff like that. Those of us who started early because, and we were also doing the social media thing, but they were doing more of the barnstorming and the calling, which we started getting into once that became more of a thing. But before that, we were just on the streets. So yeah, they did not come here until March 2016.
I think this is what's really missed in the whole debate about Miss Senator Sanders versus Hillary Clinton. And that's one of the things I personally would I can't believe Bernie Sanders' behavior since the election. But the issue is that there were people who were very personally invested, still are personally invested in the senator's agenda and his success, and to some extent rightfully so. I mean, a lot of these people, they want to deal with the bank bailouts. They want to deal. They believe in universal health care. I happen to disagree about that. And yet, on the other side of that primary campaign, there was a very regimented and almost military structure in the Hillary Clinton campaign. And this is why when I started seeing these articles, my first reaction was, well, who did they hack in the Bernie Sanders campaign? The campaign was over. There was no organization, so to speak, in Southern California to deal with a fake news avalanche, as John Mattis claimed it was. So
they almost dropped us, to be honest, in California. Near as the primaries were running on, and of course California is one of the last. The campaign stopped really putting any attention on California, believe it or not, right, as we were coming up to our primary.
Mm-hmm.
And
I remember that.
Our regional director, like we were trying to get an office here, and we had found an office, and we were just trying to get some approval. I had even arranged to get it on a month to month, and got a really good deal, and we were trying to get approval from the office, the person in charge of the state, and they wouldn't even call the regional director back. So even people within the campaign were frustrated about the lack of attention that was being given by the campaign out here in California.
Well, if I may, I think that there was a real issue that people ignore, which was that there was a chance at one point for Bernie Sanders to change the election and provide I don't know what you would call it, like an alternative vision for the Democratic Party. In fact, I was debating with a number of people today who are saying, well, the Democratic Party, it's because of those damn Bernie people that we're losing members. And my reaction was that, but like him or not, and I really don't like him, but he presents at least a vision of something, as opposed to a complete and utter mock-up, which is what his primary opponent, Hillary Clinton, did. By the way, the other primary opponents were also completely ignored. James Webb and that weirdo Lincoln Chafee. They might have just thought he was irrelevant because he was. But beyond
Martin
that,
O'Malley was another strong contender who kind of got no attention.
Right, and I think that unfortunately, I grew up in a very Democratic family, and it was that type of experience in 2000. I was not yet of voting age. That with Al Gore, who I thought was quite obviously just a joke of a person, it got me to walk away from the Democratic Party, which we'll kind of touch on that phenomenon later if you've heard of it, but. Could you please describe so Mr. Mattis was a San Diego area reporter. He also reported for I think it was XETV out of Tijuana for a while, and for Fox 6 San Diego and NBC
Fox San Diego, yeah.
Right, and NBC 7 San Diego. What were you acquainted with Mr. Mattis prior to his engagement with the Sanders campaign?
No, not personally. What's interesting is that I actually he got into a big fight with some speculator here in San Diego, and he was reporting on a story about there's some kind of fraud, like with straw buyers. This is during the housing bubble. And I was involved with the housing bubble blog world back in the day. And so this video kind of went viral amongst the housing bubble blogs back then, because we admired him because he stood up to this guy. He never threw a punch, interestingly enough, and this guy got sued, thank goodness, because that part I agree. So I said, and that was one of the reasons why I trusted him. Okay. And also his connection with the Iran-Contra stuff, I thought, okay, here's a guy who seems to be pretty legit, because Josephine had expressed doubts from the beginning. It's always hard to trust people in politics because you never know who's really working for whom. But I said, no, I think we can trust this guy, and so I did. But we did not meet him until we became engaged with the PDA, which I had been a member of nationally, but not the locals. So when they were the ones who really got Bernie to run, and once they were working on that, I contacted National PDA, and they directed us to the San Diego Metro chapter of PDA. And that's where John and this other fellow, Mike Stoller, were working together. So we said we were the social media side, and they were the more organized. And the PDA is not like a big, powerful Democratic, hardcore Democratic organization. It's, from what I can see, it's way more grassroots, and they were involved with that. So we hooked up, and we kind of parsed out like how we would handle different aspects of the campaign, and that's how we met and worked together.
Right, and I also noticed personally that Mattis had a career that seemed rather burnished by, the Iran-Contra issue. I don't know how, high profile his actual contribution was, but yes, he was involved in it, and there was, I believe, it was either the Chicago Tribune or the New York Times, a write-up that included his name, and he was part of Senator Kerry's committee research team probing that topic. And by the way, the topic is something that I cover a lot because I do research the whole Nicaragua issue of today.
Yep.
But since then, it seems like his journalistic career is kind of gone the way of the dodo, because there's really a lot of his stories, and I do goof on people, so I'll try to control myself, because I thought that video was hilarious of him getting punched by that guy. But that might have been it is a respectable topic, going after real estate, housing bubble people. But another thing that he was doing were these weird stories about payphone scams and things like that. But I don't. To be honest with you, I think there's bigger fish to fry right now than payphone overcharges. So
right, but that was before this stuff came about, and I agree. But at least he was covering consumer issues and things like that, which I thought were. And during the housing bubble, that was straw buyers and all that kind of fraud. That was a big deal back then, which of course was part of what led up to the financial crisis. So.
Right.
I think that was important that he was looking into it at least, and he did bring some attention to it.
So I believe that, okay, so you said that he started, how did he start to engage with the campaign? Or was he already with the campaign at one of the early stages?
He was never officially with the campaign. He was with the PDA, which is the Progressive Democrats of America, in the San Diego Metro chapter. And again, like with us, the campaign never really interacted with us. He talks about the Skype call that we had, which I was there for also. Bernie Sanders called in. There was the Fresno chapter of the PDA and the San Diego chapter of the PDA were on this Skype call with Bernie. And it was essentially Bernie giving his usual speech, his oligarchy speech and everything else, and rising up and revolution and all that, which, we all appreciate it. It wasn't as much a back and forth as it was a Bernie speech, So, and we all just cheered him on and said, we're working for you, and we wish you luck in this contest. And that's the last that we heard from Bernie. So, until a year later, when some of his staffers came out, that was it.
So essentially, there was what my impression of this, okay, and I can be wrong, and I don't know if you agree with me, but we could both be wrong, is that John Mattis was working on behalf of a larger political organization to monitor grassroots activists in California to make sure that they were not making too much headway in promoting Senator Sanders' campaign. Would you say that he was, what was his contribution to these grassroots efforts, if at all?
Well, he made a point of being one of the financial contributors to the grassroots, on-the-ground stuff. And I saw Mike had his own PAC that he ran, I believe, kind of co-ran with John. I saw Mike giving John money. Whenever John said that he was spending money for something, I would see Mike handing him a check on the side.
This is Mike.
So
Mike
even
who?
John's claims that he was paying for stuff was not really true, because he was being reimbursed by Mike.
Mike, sorry, which...
Mike Thaler. And I don't really want to bring his name into it, because he's a different, he wasn't, I think he was vote blue no matter who. He was the chair of the Progressive Caucus here in California Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't want to besmirch anyone's reputation or anything, so I'm going to keep it more or less on John, but just his claim that he had paid for all these things isn't true.
Okay.
And then they would have these fundraisers that they would call beers for Bernie. And there's like, for every beer you buy, donate $1 to the kitty, for Bernie. But then once all this Russia stuff came up, I started looking into more what he was doing, and I looked up his contributions to Bernie. He made 0 contributions to Bernie. The PAC made 0 contributions to Bernie. So he was raising money under the guise of contributing it to Bernie's campaign, and not a dime of that ever went to Bernie's campaign.
Okay, so I think that would be something we could discuss off air, because there could be some legal ramifications to that.
Right.
But I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know much about you, but in any case,
no, my thing is just that one of his claims was that he was a big financial supporter, and then it turns out that was not true at all.
Well, I looked into John Mattis's FEC filings, and they didn't appear to be contributions at all to Senator Sanders. I think he made some generic contributions to, it might have been Act Blue at the time,
right?
Which indicates nothing. So
right, they're an aggregator, so they don't really, yeah.
Right. I have to confess that my the people that watch my show are going to laugh at me, but I contributed in 2016 to Tim Canova just because I hated Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and I think that money went to the Democrats. So.
Well, it should have gone through Act Blue, hopefully, to Tim Canova's campaign. None of us really knows what happens to any monies that are left over, if there's anything left over. Usually there's not. But it is my understanding, but that's not written in stone, that it can go back to the Democratic Party, which is a huge problem in itself. But, yeah.
Right. So Mattis is attached to all these activities, and then, of course, I inspected the timeline in that group that you were a part of, that Crystal Coleman was the founder of. And I didn't see many activities on the part of John Mattis prior to the end of the official primary season.
Right.
And then later, there are a number of appearances of his closer to the convention time, I believe, and then later, leading up to the whole episode we're talking about with the Russia hysteria and the panic, what they would call in Britain Project Fear concerning Donald Trump. So you personally interacted with John Mattis up until I believe March of 2017. Is that correct?
Yeah, right before the story came out. So yes.
And how would you describe his countenance when discussing politics in person, if you did?
He was very much a Democrat. So there are people, like, you can't just say Democrats are all one thing. There are many different types of Democrats. You have the establishment, neoliberal, warmongering Democrats. You have Democrats who are labor Democrats, who have been a dwindling share of the Democratic Party for years now. You have the identity politics Democrats who are tied in with the neoliberals. You have again, people who just don't like Republicans, those people who register as Democrats because they don't like Republicans. So you have a lot of different types of Democrats. And I would say that he was, just based on what I could see, I believe that he thinks he's doing the right thing, I think. When he started talking about the Russian propaganda, and there was that one time at a Democratic club meeting that we confronted him, and he said, Russian propaganda, and it was kind of a shouting match at that point. They turned on the music really loud to drown us out, because we were trying to explain what really happened. It was interesting. And he said, what Russian propaganda? And I told him, what about the American propaganda? He says, but at least that's our propaganda. That's okay.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. Yeah.
And I'm like, propaganda is, and then it was interesting that he has a connection with David Brock, who's the propaganda spinmeister of Washington, D.C. And then it just all makes sense. Kind of once that was discovered, it's like, oh, now all that makes sense. Because we were having a much, much bigger problem on all of the Facebook pages with Correct the Record trolls, not with Russians. That was nothing. We had Correct the Record trolls who were just nonstop harassing us every day. And even at one point, right before there was like a Super Tuesday event, they posted kiddie porn, child pornography, on a bunch of the most popular Bernie Facebook pages to have them taken down.
Wait. Can you repeat that? Was this on your page?
No, it did not happen to our page, but it happened to a lot of the very popular, like, national Bernie Facebook pages. We were a local Facebook page. But this happened on big national Facebook pages for Bernie.
And these were kind of sock accounts that were on behalf of CTR?
I don't know if they're sock accounts. I think they were legitimate accounts, because how they discovered who did that was apparently some of the Bernie supporters were spying on the Correct the Record forums, and somebody was bragging about what they had done. And some other people were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you just said that right now on a public forum. Don't you know that this is a public forum, blah, blah, blah. And they tried to shut this guy down, but nonetheless, that's how we figured out who did it. And it just makes all the sense in the world, because they were trying to shut it down before a big primary event. So, yeah, those are the problems that we actually had.
So you
whatever.
Right, and this was something I didn't know about, the child porn, which I think that's like really, how hard do you really want to win an election to do something so like idiotic?
Right, and I can send you a link. If you didn't know about that, I can send you a link to that.
Well, I mean, I don't want a link that's too graphic, but
No, a link to the report about it, where they did a screenshot of the forum where they were bragging about it.
Okay, yeah,
hopefully I can find that if it's not scrubbed from the internet.
So Mr. Mattis, I believe you said that you were personally friends with him and his wife or fiance, and I know that his sister was active in the group, although I believe she was living in a different state.
She's in the East Coast, yeah.
Right, and so your interactions with him, were they more of a familial? The families were friends, or was it more related to the political commonality between you two at the time?
Well, we're all very political people, and but it was a social relationship as well.
Okay. So yeah. At these interactions, was he really discussing his issues with, his decision to commit to voting for Hillary Clinton, which later Josephine Perulli told me, or was he kind of playing possum and not discussing that?
He wasn't so much discussing Clinton as he did the Democratic narrative of anyone but Trump, and that was a Republican narrative too. But I can't believe, anybody would vote for Trump. Trump is so heinous. Trump is so blah, blah, blah. And so he spoke more about his aversion to Trump than his love for Hillary, to be honest. I just think that he's a Democrat's Democrat. There are these people, we call them vote blue no matter who Democrats, and they just vote straight ticket without thinking, instead of going through person by person and issue by issue and determining their vote that way. They just go all Democrat, and he's one of those types.
Yeah, and I think that might be one of the reasons that the two main political parties are they're disintegrating because the leadership and the key people is composed of people who are concerned more about their affiliation than about actually proposing any policy or forwarding an agenda. For example, this is just an aside. We'll get back to the topic at hand. When I was a kid, I thought that being liberal meant that you believed in nature conservation, but nobody cares about that anymore. So I kind of have, I would say most of my belief systems now are closer to the conservative side, but I'm still considering not voting for, a number of the Republican candidates this year because they're not interesting people. They seem to be kind of just a bunch of dudes.
Well, they have their power networks, and they already hold power. They're established power. And it's tied into the corporate world, the financial world, and this is on both sides, by the way. Mm-hmm. And so their concerns have nothing at all to do with the concerns of the people. It's entirely based on the interests that they represent. And even like the Democratic Party, once upon a time, at least could pretend that it represented the interests of labor and workers. And they gave up on workers, 30, 40 years ago. So even there, the Democratic Party has just become, and everything has become about climate change instead of environmental pollution. Based on your, conservation and pollution thing, we've all gone on to the way to make money via climate change instead of perhaps discussing ways that we could eliminate planned obsolescence, which is a far greater contributor to the world's pollution than somebody driving a car to work,
Right.
Things like that.
Yeah, those are probably issues that I'd be more interested in that's kind of why I shirk belonging to a political party personally, because the Republican Party sure as hell doesn't care about that either. Yeah. And by the way, we have in the chat my colleague Adrian Lloyd, also known as Just My Stupid Opinion, who spoke undercover to John Mattis, and Mattis himself said to Adrian on the phone that both political parties are pretty much corrupt to the core. And then he said, but Bernie did the right thing by rendering himself unto the, under the allegiance of Queen Hillary. That was a very surreal conversation I was hearing. And recently, I don't know if we ever told you, but me and Adrian, I don't know if he was in on that Twitter fight, but it was me and Comrade McCarthy, who's one of my friends on YouTube. we actually confronted Mattis on Twitter, and Mattis was, basically McCarthy is a former Bernie voter from California, and he said, look, you're a complete liar, and everything you said is total bullshit. And Mattis said, well, what about the indictments? And then I said, the indictments have nothing to do with anything you've talked about. They don't mention anything concerning San Diego Berniecrats at all. There's literally no mention of anything you were talking about. It's like, if and by the way, I'd like to raise that issue. If there was any untoward behavior on Joanne Allen's Facebook group, and her and a number of other people I've spoken to already, James Boydston and Josephine Perulli, then why was it not in the indictment? Because he was on TV with Ari Melber, he was on TV with Rachel Maddow, yet all the evidence, supposed evidence that he has featured, is not germane to the topic. These are posts made by, real actual people. Those are the people. Yeah.
There are the indictments of the quote, I believe it's 12 Russian. Hang on, let me just see it is. The Russian spies or agents who were indicted in the Mueller investigation. That was for posting a bunch of cartoons and comics and things about Hillary with horns on her head, and even Facebook's, I believe as a vice president of something of marketing, said this had nothing to do with anything. That Facebook had originally come out and say, no, we don't see any evidence of Russian hacking. And then, of course, Obama met with Zuckerberg. And then, lo and behold, a week or so later, look, there's Russian hacking. And some of the people in Facebook executives were saying, this is nothing. And then they had this phony indictment, and then the Russians showed up and said, okay, we're going to show up to court. Because they were hoping that the Russians wouldn't show up to court, because then they wouldn't have to produce any evidence. And the Russians showed up to court, and now they don't want to produce any evidence because, national security, of course. So even that, and again, the things that they were talking about, there was nothing like necessarily pro-Bernie, anti-Hillary, anti-Trump. It was all of it. It was pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro-Bernie, anti-Bernie, pro-Hillary, anti-Hillary. More than half of it, I believe, happened after the general election. So this is clearly not something that was necessarily going to do anything with our election, either the primaries or the general election. So I'm not quite sure why anybody would think that's an issue. But if you wanted to tie something into John's story, then that would be the issue that that you would tie into it. But But if we want to look into that, because there's more stuff here that has come out lately. The people who are trying to push this Russian story are kind of in a bind because they can't produce evidence.
Yeah, and I would say across the board, and we'll get in due time to the issue of how I'm sorry to say, but I think we've kind of I feel that our effort is kind of in vain in many ways, but and I'll describe really what we've been trying to do, but essentially the entire story is predicated on this peekaboo game that they're trying to play with an attention span lacking public that doesn't really care about the details. Now there are enough people, thank God, that are paying more attention to the details because of the distrust of other aspects of the media, that the Hillary Clinton narrative has kind of it's falling on the deaf ears of many Americans. There's less and less trust of the mainstream media nowadays on both the right and parts of the left.
No, big parts of the left. Big parts of the left.
Right, and I think, but unfortunately, the visibility of those now I do pay attention to left-wing outlets that are alternative. However,
right.
When it comes to the powers that be, they don't see that. Do you feel personally that Senator Sanders has kind of neglected this aspect of the campaign in order to kind of make peace with the Democratic Party, Senator Schumer, who's the Senate Majority Leader, and preserve his stake in the committees that he believes are more important to him?
I don't know what his motivations are, but for sure there are many, many, many Bernie Sanders supporters who are completely disillusioned at this point. He didn't call out the election fraud that was happening all across the country during the primaries, and it was radical. It was so in your face, the election fraud. And that's the other thing that bothers a lot of us, that they talk about this Russian thing that has absolutely nothing to do with anything, but they didn't talk about the hundreds of thousands of people who were knocked off the voter rolls, or the precincts that were Bernie friendly having shortages of ballots all across the country, and then being told that they had to wait 8 hours or something in order to vote. They didn't talk about the fact that California's election was called before we actually had a chance to vote, before Election Day. The fact that we had ballots that were whited out in the Registrar of Voters' office. The fact that we had an unprecedented number of vote-by-mail ballots that were never received by any of the voters, and then they were given provisional ballots, so we had an unprecedented number of provisional ballots. We had a lot of signatures. This is something kind of more from the inside, that a lot of signature mismatches on the vote-by-mail ballots compared to their voter registration cards. And the person who was in charge of that at the Registrar of Voters' office told the clerks that they were not allowed to challenge past X number of signatures. And then he told me that most of those ballots were going to go through anyway. So he did not care if they were actually valid voters or not. I have a suspicion, and this is completely a suspicion based on my experience at the Registrar of Voters' office and in also watching my polling location and other people watching their polling locations, I have a suspicion that a lot of the vote-by-mail ballots, especially the ones of inactive voters, were withheld and possibly tampered with. And then they gave them provisional ballots that they showed up at the polls. They were thinking they wouldn't show up because they're inactive voters. And then when they did show up at the polls, they would give them provisional ballots. But the way it works is those vote-by-mail ballots would be counted and the provisional ballots would be thrown out. So whatever the people voted wouldn't count.
So getting back, yeah. So getting back to John Mattis, of course, he lived through that primary, and to your knowledge, was he active in any efforts to bring this more to light? Or was he more willing to sweep? I mean, let's just say it. I mean, sweep it under the rug and go forward into the campaign. I mean, you kind of interacted with him on a more personal level than Jim Boydston or Joe Pierulli. So did he mention it at all? Was it kind of a topic of importance to him?
He switched quickly to anti-Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't even really focus on, Bernie or Hillary or even the Democratic primaries. He wasn't even that active through the primary season. Again, on Facebook, he was hardly active at all.
Mm-hmm.
He would do some events, but it was like he would do like the easy events that got a lot of attention and not a lot of the kind of hard, on the ground, digging trenches, interfacing with people from all backgrounds kind of work, So he did more of the see me type stuff,
mm-hmm.
and it was here and there. So he didn't do a ton of stuff during the primaries.
So distributing leaflets and going door to door, not so much?
Not for Bernie. Now, he did do leaflets for a number of local candidates, and they had Bernie on the top.
Okay.
So, but I don't know how much he actually went door to door. He wanted other people to go door to door, and he arranged for those flyers to be made. But I don't know that he actually did the walking.
So getting past the actual campaign now, of course, November comes and the Trump election occurred, and obviously, I think I got drunk on rum that night and showed up to work pretty tipsy, and because I really hate Hillary Clinton since I was
that makes a whole bunch of us. Quite frankly, I was cheering not because I like Trump. I hate Trump. Like as a person, I've hated him since the 80s. I think he's obnoxious, but I was really, really excited to see Hillary lose, and I think a lot of other people, even longtime registered Democrats, were very happy to see Hillary lose. Not happy to see Trump win.
Yeah, and I always liked Bill Clinton because he was kind of a jackass and he was hilarious, but Hillary Clinton was really, never a fun person. Of course, I was 11 years old when the Monica Lewinsky scandal happened, so she was kind of the person who ruined the fun in my mind. But then later I read about both of them, and they just seem to be very bizarre people in different ways. They're two different types of awful, in my opinion. But of course,
he's in touch with the people. I do believe that. I think he has what Trump has in the sense that he's aware more of what's going on with the people. Hillary is completely detached. She has no idea whatsoever what's going on with people on the ground. It's like her feet never touch the earth, So I think that's one of the biggest problems for her and why she's so unlikable. And then, of course, on the Democrat side, especially those of us who are labor Democrats, she never addressed labor. She never addressed any of the issues that we want to see, with relation to trade, immigration, tariffs, taxation. Any of those issues were not touched by her. It was all identity politics, and that's what they hung their hats on, and they got their tails handed to them as a result. Because a lot of their most ardent supporters and the people who go to the polls every single election, myself included, we are not voting for identity politics. We think it's divisive. We think that it's trying to tear American citizens apart so that the people at the top can continue with their pillaging and looting, and we don't focus on them. That's just my take on it, and I think that's why Hillary is so despised, even among many Democrats.
Right. That's kind of, I mean, it mirrors my, the person who got me interested in politics. I mean, Ralph Nader was kind of somebody I was interested at one point, but Ron Paul talking
Hmm.
about withdrawing, fighting against corporate welfare and reducing military commitments overseas. That was the
Yep.
person who got me, and he's not really focused on identity politics. But back to, so that election night, the kind of the script flips, and
Hmm.
John Mattis eventually, he goes through a few months until that story comes out. So
Hmm.
between November and March, um, you were you meeting with him? Was there like any, was there any interaction with him on the part of yourself or other people in the group?
For sure, there was less. I was still going to the PDA meetings, so I would see him there. We would see each other personally sometimes.
Hmm.
But once the Democratic primaries were over, as far as I'm concerned, the election was, I knew who was going to win because I was on the street talking to people. He was not, like I said, he never did any of the stuff where he was on the street talking to people, not that I ever saw. So I was talking to people from all political persuasions, and my friends. I have a wide circle of friends who come from every single possible point on the political spectrum. And so I knew that it was either going to be Trump or Bernie in 2016. And once Hillary stole the election, then it was going to be Trump. So, and as far as I'm concerned, I don't see him as any more evil than she is. So I did not do anything for the general election.
Hmm.
Some local issues, yes, but not as far as presidential candidates. And he might have been more involved than in the presidential election, and stirring up, oh, Trump, 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 Um, again, I saw him, but whenever we talked, I would let my thoughts be known, but he wouldn't really, he would just talk about Trump being bad. So like I said, I think even for him, it was more of an anti-Trump thing than it was a pro-Hillary thing. But then, of course, once you see that he's been in contact with David Brock, that kind of changes the whole picture, I think. I think he
Well,
was trying to. There were a lot of people in the Democratic Party who were trying to be friendly with Bernie supporters in the hopes that once the primaries were over, they could shift everybody over to Hillary Clinton. And we would have meetings like in the PDA. So when Bernie loses, how are we going to get everybody to vote for Hillary? They would have these sessions,
mhm.
which some of us thought was absolutely ridiculous because, like, we're not here for Hillary, we're here for Bernie. And if Bernie's not on the ticket, then it really becomes a meaningless activity for a lot of us. Um, so anyway, I don't, like I said, I don't know. I think he was a mole. In retrospect, I think he was a mole. I think he was trying to play friendly. And just to your thing, I think you might be surprised to know that a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters were also Ron Paul supporters
Hmm. No,
because there are a
that's
lot
not
of less.
surprising, but yeah,
There's
yeah.
a lot of less libertarians out there.
Hmm.
And even though we might not agree entirely, like in theory, I can see where Ron Paul has points, but I think that in practice it doesn't work out the way he would like it to because there are always going to be power vacuums and somebody's going to fill them,
Okay.
you know? And I think that pure libertarianism is a little bit too theoretical, wouldn't necessarily work. And people can argue that about socialism too, whatever. But I think in terms of civil liberties and civil rights and anti-war and anti-imperialism and all that sort of stuff, I think there is a huge overlap between a lot of people on the left and a lot of people on the right. And interestingly enough, and all of us are also, by the way, against corporate ownership of our political system, right? I think
Correct.
all of us are opposed to huge monopolies and the corporate world controlling everything that happens here and abroad. And I think that you'll notice if you look at the censorship on the internet and the people that they're going after, a lot of people complain, oh, they're attacking the right and they're censoring the right. But they're not just censoring the right. They're also censoring the left in a big way.
Hmm.
But it's the kind of left libertarian independent types, not the establishment democratic types. But the independent left is being silenced all over the board.
Right, and I think that I listened to Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you're familiar with him, who's not really a political scientist, but he's more of a psychologist from Toronto, and he says that it is important, and I am, I'm 100%. There's a few issues I disagree with on libertarianism, and and I am a conservationist in terms of the environment, but he says, like Dr. Peterson says, that the importance of having a left-wing perspective is mostly related to civil liberties, and the left wing that's perceived in the media today, or shown in the media, is the exact opposite. They're the censorship left. They're the control and dictate left. And unfortunately, I think, I was arguing with people today, and they were, they were saying that it's important to remain in the Democratic Party in order to preserve sanity there. And I said, well, no. If people, as much as I disagree with them about a certain topic, happen to be the topic of the Middle East, but even, as much as I disagree with people, they have the right to, if you don't let them vote in the party, and it's called the Democratic Party, and you don't let them air their thoughts out, then it's kind of a joke. You might as well found your own party and develop a platform of your own. But the Democratic Party, such as it is, does not have any ideas. It doesn't. That's really what Senator Sanders was giving. By the way, that's what Ron Paul was giving in 2012 and 2008. So with of course the winter of 2017, there was the whole resistance and the Women's March and Indivisible and all those groups. So John
all
Mattis,
the AstroTurf stuff.
Sure. Well, John Mattis, was he active in any of that type of activity?
Yes.
Okay, so he was active in Indivisible. I'm pretty sure I saw his photo on some of their posts.
Yep. Now, I don't know if he was actively involved in Indivisible per se. He was part of the resistance. He would do a lot of these, like light brigades or something, freeway overpass light brigades, where resist Trump and stuff like that. So the resist movement. And I know that they worked with Indivisible. I don't think he likes to work under anybody. Here's an interesting thing. Here is one interesting thing that I do know about him, is he wants to control things, but he doesn't want his name on the outside of it. So he will not put his name to any particular organization, and who knows why, but he wants to control it. So that's always kind of interesting on how that works, And as far as the Indivisible thing, I don't think he wants to do something that somebody else is telling him to do. He wants to be a leader, but again, without his name attached to anything officially.
Right. My impression of him is that he's sort of a mercenary journalist, and it's very fitting that he had any contact with David Brock, who himself, he exposed the Troopergate issue in the early 90s, which was a true story of Governor Clinton using state troopers to procure, a bunch of women, which was a kind of a bright idea if you don't get caught. But, in retrospect, I guess he wasn't held accountable anyway. And then he just flipped over and pretended that he was wrong about exposing it. Never actually, he never actually debunked his own story. He just claimed he was wrong for exposing it.
Right.
So John Mattis, in March of 2017, his name starts appearing on the Huffington Post, and we've been through that on other interviews already, and we might touch on it tomorrow night, depending on the availability of your colleagues, Jim and Josephine. But what was your reaction to seeing this guy talking about Russia infiltrating your group, and then later with Rachel Maddow? I mean, you obviously tried to contact him, but could you please walk us through that?
Well, we were absolutely flabbergasted when we saw the Rachel Maddow show. Somebody else had seen it, because we don't watch Rachel Maddow. Somebody else had seen it and sent it to Jim, I believe, and said, "Oh my God, look at this! You won't believe it." And we immediately tried to contact John and say, "What the heck are you talking about? You know this is a lie. You know, first off, that you were never an administrator or a moderator on this page or any other of the Bernie Facebook pages," because we had a lot of Facebook pages. You were never a moderator or an admin. And we never had problems with Russian trolls. I mean, that was not something that people were going, oh my, look at all the Russian trolls. It was like, oh my gosh, look at all the correct the record trolls, you know? And he would not respond. He would not respond, would not respond, would not respond. And then he finally sent me a message on Facebook, and I think I had sent that over to you, that just basically said, you know that I paid money or something to the campaign. And that's when I looked up his records, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he paid nothing to the campaign. And then that was it. And then he sent his wife after us and his sister, which I thought was really interesting because, I mean, his wife and I would talk, but he and I talked more. And all of a sudden, when this Russian thing came out, it was his wife who was emailing me and attacking me for this, that, and the other, and then his sister would be attacking us on Facebook.
Right.
But John would never.
I remember seeing Sarah Mattis's messages on Facebook, and it was clear that I think personally, I could be wrong, but she wasn't clued into what he was really doing.
I think that neither his sister nor his wife were aware of what was really going on. Because at one point when I explained it and I did step by step with his wife, she goes, okay, I'm still mad, but I think I understand where you're coming from. Mm-hmm. And then I believe John showed him some of our interactions on Facebook where we were really challenging him about what the heck are you talking about? You've got, who are you working with Hillary? Because I kept saying, who's paying you, John? Who's paying you to say this? Who's paying you to do this? Because in my opinion, it was pretty clear that it was not just coming from him. Because why wouldn't he, if we were the admins of this page, why would he not, if he thought there were Russian infiltrators, right, Russian bots, wouldn't the logical thing be to come to us and say, hey, you guys, I think I'm noticing this pattern. What do you guys think? He never once mentioned it to us. And like I said, I was with him just the week before, and he was supposedly in the middle of this whole revelation, and he never said a word. And we were talking about politics, because that's what we do, never said a word. The only time I heard him mention Russia was at that PDA meeting when he said, you know what scares old white people? The reason why Trump won is because of old white people. And if there's one thing that I know that old white people are afraid of, it's Russia. And so we need to, hit them with Russia, basically. Mm-hmm. That was the first time, and then then when that story came out, it suddenly clicked. It's like, oh my gosh, this is what he's aiming for. So it seems to me that this was a story that was manufactured, according to what he was saying at the PDA, it was to get old white people to be afraid of anything connected to Russia, because they lived through the whole Red Scare thing.
Right, and I think it's kind of a indication of how tone deaf he is, because a lot of people have, they're conscious of the fact that, Russia is not like our friend, but
they're not our enemy.
Well, I would say that, there's very spurious proof that Russia had any involvement to the level that he's talking about. And on that note, by the way, to the audience, people who are just joining me, my guest is on the phone, Joanne Allen from San Diego Bernie Kratz. So to that end, when you were at that meeting, what was the reaction of the audience to his proposal?
A lot of us actually laughed. I laughed out loud because I thought he was joking. And then as he kept ranting, I realized, oh my God, he's serious. And a lot of us actually left at that point. That's when I left that group. Mm-hmm. Because I'm like, okay, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley where we had bomb sirens going off. They would test the bomb sirens because we had a lot of the aerospace companies there. And I remember that. And I don't want to live through that again. And to me, all of this Russia baiting is bringing us back to a time that a lot of us really don't want to revisit. I think that we're in dangerous territory. And it looks to me, because if you look at who's been the aggressor, it's not been Russia versus, Russia versus the U.S. It's not been Russia. And I really have to question our motives. Of course, we all wonder about, oil and access to pipelines. I think that's really what's driving all this, and it has nothing to do with election meddling or anything. That's just the ruse. Like, we always have a ruse to do whatever we do. When we overthrow democratically elected leaders, we always have some sort of benevolent-sounding story to use as a front. And so I think that they're using this, quote, election meddling nonsense as some kind of a front to go after Russia for the stuff that we actually care about, which is oil, gas, pipelines, stuff like control over certain regions that are strategic for one reason or another, ports and things like that. And I think that's ultimately why we're doing this. I don't think I don't think that Russia is a threat. I think if we left Russia alone, that they wouldn't be a threat to us in 100 million years. I just don't.
Right.
So,
and yeah, me personally, I grew up, my, one half of my family is from Western Ukraine.
yeah.
And we're kind of removed, so I never spoke Russian, but, there's a huge Russian community here, both Russian Jewish and Ukrainian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox here. And every single Russian I meet is like, basically the coolest man in the world. They're like, hey, you want vodka shot? We do, basically, all the time party people. And
Right.
the image that they're portraying in the media is that it's basically a country full of robotic Ivan Drago people from Rocky IV,
Right.
That's kind of a very exaggerated picture of the country.
Completely.
Right, and it's not to say, I of course am a supporter of Senator Paul and to some extent President Trump, and I'm watching the events of the past week, and it's like, I have a career and stuff to think about. I don't want to be in a war with a country halfway around the world over nothing. So
no, exactly. A war based on the false premise, I believe, of keeping one of the most unlikable and untrustworthy candidates out of office. And they knew this going in. When they first were running for office, Hillary's likability numbers and trustworthiness numbers, they were absolutely abysmal. So, and everybody knew this. And people within her campaign knew that she was completely unpopular. So I don't know. My family, my maternal side of my family is from Europe, and they lived through World War II, and it was the Russians who fought the Nazis. So it was, so I don't have this strong, oh my God, Russia's the enemy sort of perspective that a lot of Americans who've never had any interaction with Europe or Russia or anything else, that they tend to have because of our propaganda here in the United States. So, again, I'm not saying, Russia's this great thing. I'm just saying I don't see them as an enemy. I don't see them as a threat. I really don't. They were a threat during the Cold War because we threatened them. And they were simply trying to assert themselves and say, look, you're not going to push us around. And that's what happens when one person becomes really antagonistic and really aggressive, then the other party is left with no choice but to either roll over or become aggressive in return. So I just think I'm very worried that we're heading back down that path, that now we're going to force Russia into a position of aggression. And I think that we're really skating on thin ice. And I, for one, have no desire whatsoever to continue this warmongering, especially when it's based on these ridiculous pretenses.
Yeah, I personally, I do a lot of geopolitics on my channel, which is not really that big of a crowd pleaser, but, I talk a lot about Latin America, Nicaragua and Venezuela from an economics perspective, as well as China. I have a guest on sometimes who is kind of pro-China, and I warn about the effects of China. But, if I was to stir up hysteria on the channel and say we have to go to war with China today, people would look at me like I'm some sort of a freak. But
right.
The fact is that China is a bigger threat than Russia.
Correct.
And you just have to be, circumspect about it and discuss things in a sane and sober manner when you're talking about it. I do like to joke around on my channel, but I'm not going to basically turn into some sort of war with China clown the way that the media is behaving with Russia. So, right. So essentially we've discussed John Mattis going on, or he didn't actually appear on camera with Rachel Maddow. However, right. Your friend Jim was his name was featured on screen.
And
Your
Josephine.
friend Josephine as well. Your friend, I don't know if you know Aletta Pierce.
Alita Pierce, yep.
Right. She was featured on screen. That's how I actually found any of you, thanks to Rachel Maddow.
Yeah.
Right. So how long do you think it took before people really started, or did they ever realize that the thing was nonsense among people in your group?
No. It's amazing because the three of us, Jim and Josephine and I, Alita's up in LA. And so Jim, and she was quoted in the Huffington Post piece, and that was the one person that they actually issued some kind of a correction. They said we were contacted by Alita Pierce, and she said that John got it all wrong and blah, blah, blah. I'm sure you've seen that. Mm-hmm. I contacted the Huffington Post. I contacted MSNBC. Like you can see how much traction you get with the story, right? Nothing.
Right.
And I contacted the FBI because I thought maybe they'd like to know the truth. I don't know. But they didn't.
That's funny.
Know, right? I mean,
FBI.
You get desperate.
What do you think, Fox Mulder works for them still?
Yeah, no, I think that, I think my phone's probably been tapped ever since. But, no, but you get desperate. You're like, oh my gosh, somebody needs to get the word out. And it's amazing how we got nothing. Like, you have news stories about somebody's dog being lost, okay? But you can't get any traction with the truth about this Russian bot story. Or when that one executive at Facebook tried to come out and say, look, over half of these, quote, ads weren't even related to politics or Trump or Hillary or anything else, he got slammed, and I think they were threatening to fire him right after that. Everybody was talking about boycotting Facebook because he spoke the truth. Mm-hmm. And this is something that is very, very frightening to me, how they're trying to shut down, like when Sean Hannity brought up Seth Rich. And immediately you get this huge boycott, which that's so interesting how that happens, that nobody's allowed to talk about it. And I think it's really interesting that we heard all about Trayvon Martin for years on end, which was the kind of an event that happens pretty much on a daily basis here in the United States. But we couldn't get any sort of story on Seth Rich. I think that's interesting. And then his family got a crisis management person, a PR person from the DNC.
Yeah, that's the same playbook that the Vince Foster family lived through.
Right?
Vince Foster's family. I mean, and you know, let's say it out loud. We're not accusing anybody of murder, but
nope.
He was never at that park in his life before that. So.
But we're wondering why certain stories get a lot of light and other stories get no light. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's indicative of the level of propaganda that we're being fed on a daily basis.
Right. If we were to, I mean, hypothetically, let's say that me and Joanne Allen, who's on the phone with me, were to discuss Ted Bundy right now and, you know, weird things that involve that case, we wouldn't be censored because Ted Bundy was not really, I mean, he was politically active, but he wasn't a senior political figure. But
he's not part of the establishment.
Correct. And what I've observed, and we discussed this before going on the air, is that unfortunately, you know, I'm not a professional, you know, I'm not a full-time journalist. I'm a person who, you know, I had some time and I had some attention to give, and I noticed this, and I wrote this story, and you know, the Hard News Network, I was able to publish it on their website, and you can see it in front of you right here. Those of you that are watching. So I had the time to do it, but when I contacted a number of media outlets, including American Spectator, the Daily Caller, I also contacted people on the left, such as H.A. Goodman, who I think he should be all over it, but Tim Pool.
No, we've contacted him before, too.
Yes.
And we contacted him. We contacted Caitlin Johnstone. Mm-hmm. We contacted a number of people, like, again, on the right and left, just trying to get anybody to pay attention. And we just were not able to do that, which I thought was very interesting.
Right. And you know, I mean, I think, granted, I mean, there's more, we could be doing more, but, you know, I'm really at a point of frustration here personally. Not to take it out on you, but we're really entering a period where by November, nobody's going to give a shit what happened in 2016 because people will already start talking about, oh, they screwed 2018 over. You know, they'll make up the next bullshit. right?
Mm-hmm.
So, this story, I believe, those of you that are watching in the audience, and most of these people are, they're return members to the channel, return viewers or something. We don't have membership, but the issue at hand is that this is a story where multiple media outlets, from the Young Turks' Ryan Grimm,
Mm-hmm.
who was also at the Huffington Post and is now at the Intercept, to the New
Mm-hmm.
York Times, to Newsweek, to Rachel Maddow, to Ari Melber, to BuzzFeed. Although BuzzFeed were the most responsible people in this case, they all featured this hoax journalist, and yet they're not having any consequence for this. This is, in my opinion, the equivalent of. Have you ever seen that movie Hoax with where they talked about the Howard Hughes diaries?
No, I didn't.
So in I believe it was 1972, there was a person who claimed that he had Howard Hughes' personal memoirs and that he was going to publish them, and he got a massive advance from Simon and Schuster Publishing, and then it turned out that the whole thing was just I mean they basically made it all up, and they even made audio tapes with somebody impersonating Howard Hughes. But
Wow.
this is even less sophisticated because I mean I'll be honest with you. I mean I know you were probably his friend at some point. The guy kind of seems like a clown and doesn't know the first thing about technology, which is, I mean, this isn't really high tech
Right.
we're talking about administrating a Facebook group. And yet nobody's challenged this. Nobody's gone to really looked. It's not that hard to expose,
Right.
personally. So I mean, we're this is a point where I don't want to move on, but we're
Mm-hmm.
really losing. I mean, I don't see any momentum developing, and
No.
it's really depressing to me to see that you know we see this propagation of nonsense regarding a diplomatic meeting in Russia, and
Mm-hmm.
yet nobody wants to pay attention to the outright deception that's going on with regards to the people who are speaking out in the media about Russia.
Mm-hmm. I always say if you're hearing about a story 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's propaganda. The real stories that actually matter, you'll hear it once, it'll blip past, and you'll never hear about it again. And that's the unfortunate truth that I've discussed. It's like a little bit like I said earlier, I think before the video, everybody knew about Miley Cyrus twerking at some awards show. Nobody knew about the TPP.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Why is our media focusing on things that don't matter all the time? Everybody knows about the Kardashians, even if you never watched the Kardashians. But nobody knows about the various trade policies that we have, the tax policies, the Janice case that just went through last week.
Right.
Nobody knows about that. That affects all of us, and I know you and I might have different opinions about
yeah.
that.
I mean, we both probably disagree totally on it, but I mean, a lot of people didn't even know anything about any of the Supreme Court cases in the past month,
Right.
especially that one, which is
huge. It's a huge one that will have massive effects across the country, and they're busy talking about illegal immigrants crossing the border illegally, every day, all day. Nobody, which, right or wrong, doesn't affect American citizens so much as the Janice case did, but no news coverage of the Janice case.
Right.
So it just goes to show you where they're trying to focus the attention. And again, I think that the identity politics issues are intentionally being used to distract people from the economic issues, the class issues, the global movement of human population issues, and again, and I don't mean that, like, obviously we know that there are immigration issues here and abroad, but nobody talks about why. Nobody talks about what's causing these refugee crises. Nobody's talking about the fact that we're often responsible for it. And, we could have prevented it from happening in the first place. Nobody talks about nobody talks about history. Nobody talks about any of these things. And so, but it's really easy to talk about Miley Cyrus and Kim Kardashian, or, stupid things.
Right. Just yesterday there was the All-Star game, and they were making this massive issue of a relief pitcher's racist tweets from when he was, I think, 16 or 17 years old. And by next week nobody's going to remember the guy. And it's the same thing with the immigration topic. for 8 years under President Obama, they
Mhm.
never really covered the immigration issue. I was personally, and I'm somebody who, I was reading a lot. I wasn't very politically active, but I was kind of blindsided by the rise of the immigration issue, and the media did not want to cover it. And
No.
now that it's been, the worm has turned, and President Trump is in office,
Right.
they really amplified it for about a week, and then they found the next reason to, uh, you know, basically blow their stacks.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think we should move to close, but I'm glad that we finally got to connect, even though it was a little difficult to arrange it.
Yeah.
Um, I know that we're probably at cross purposes on a number of policies, but I think it's better to have people that you disagree with, but that you can share your thoughts with freely, than
Yeah.
to engage in this sort of, um, you know, life of deception that the media is doing with people who constantly agree on screen, as many of these channels do, and that includes Fox News too.
Yes.
But
Yes.
um, I am personally pessimistic about this story, and I did try to contact a lot of outlets,
I
and it's
know,
just,
and I appreciate it, and I think you've done a tremendous job with all of your fact finding. You did a fantastic job. I will continue to use your articles because it puts it all together in one nice package with all of your links and everything. So please keep that up, and know that some of us really appreciate it. And again, as far as differences and opinions, we would hope that we all have differences of opinions. If we all have the same opinions, then something is wrong, right?
yeah.
And we need to avoid the flame throwing and the name calling, and actually be able to sit down and have conversations about why we all come to our various perspectives. We all have different life experiences, different knowledge, different relationships with different types of people and situations and industries and everything else. And that's what forms our thoughts and opinions. And I'd like to think that there's more gray than there is black and white, and that most of us will generally agree on the most important issues. We might differ on how to get there, but I think that most people want the same sorts of things. So,
So one question I forgot. I mean, I know I was going to close, but there is a walk away movement happening where there's a lot of, it's very strange, and the media is now, also tying it to Russia, which is it just shows how idiotic our country has become. But I see a lot of Mexican people, black people, gay people who are leaving, so to speak, the Democratic Party. Um, do you feel that you experienced such a change in terms of the party, or did
absolutely.
right? So
The Democratic Party could not have done a better job of turning us off to the Democratic Party and turning us on to Trump. Really.
uh-huh.
Like I said, I was never a fan of Trump's at any point in time since the 1980s when I knew about him. And I swear to God, they make me feel sympathetic for the guy. And he's the least sympathetic character on the planet, but I actually feel sympathy for him because I see them conspiring to hit him from every possible direction. Anything that he tries to do that might help the American people, they pummel him from some other side, try to distract from whatever that topic is, and hit him with something else. They literally parse through all of his words and his phrases and try to find the one little thing that they can interpret in a particular way that will sound negative. And I'll tell you something else. I know a lot of black, brown, gay, whatever people, and you might find this hard to believe. A lot of them voted for Trump, actually, in 2016, and a lot of them are more secure in their feelings going forward that that's what they're going to do again in 2020. And one thing that the Democrats just seem to forget is that around 30% of the Hispanic population voted for Trump. They never bothered to ask why. And this is after they were being told that they were Nazi white supremacists and KKK members, for a year and a half if they voted for Trump. So, and they still voted for Trump. So I think people need to step back and say, why is this?
Right. I remember personally during the camp, I was always, and I still am, and people will probably eventually make fun of me for this, but I'm still a huge fan of Senator Paul because he has the ideas that I identify with. But during the campaign, I had a vote for Governor Kasich here in
Mhm.
Ohio, and then after he made a fool of himself, I was like, you know what? Trump might be a jackass,
Mhm.
but I'm also a jackass and like to do like crazy like trolling things on the internet sometimes, getting into like kind of winding people up. Does this guy kind of represent my personality, if not necessarily all of my ideas?
Mhm.
And there have been a lot of areas, for example, with the oil industry and appointing Rex Tillerson, where I find
Right.
him to kind of be, it's like, come on, dude. And then
Right.
there's other issues where, for example, he's talking about actually renegotiating NAFTA, or another example is the school choice issue, which I believe in,
Mhm.
where I'm like, you know, I have nothing to complain about on that. But you have to be a reasonable person and not get your hopes up, or
Mhm.
lose your temper at the slightest thing. Do you have any last comments to make before we close for the evening?
My only last comment would be, let's hope that somebody at some point in time looks back and tries to pick up the crumbs of truth that are lying around that nobody is picking up. And I appreciate your work in trying to get that out there, very much so. And let's just keep trying. I'm going to keep trying. We've all been burned out. Josephine, Jim, and I have been. I was particularly burned out because of the same thing you're experiencing. We would try to get traction. We would try to tell people, nobody would listen. And I don't know why that is. We've done everything we can, and I don't know why that is.
Right. I recommend. I call in on well, it's on Saturday nights and Wednesday nights. This YouTube creator named Anthony Logan, and you could describe your story. He'll probably listen to you for a good 15 minutes, and he's aware of the story because I've talked to him about it. Um, so you can call in. I know that phone is the best communication method of yours. I can share that info for you
Okay.
offline. But you know, again, like I'm saying this to the audience because Joanne's already made this point. Um, we have the chance with this story to expose basically a number of high-profile journalists as complete, amateurs. They basically bought hook, line, and sinker the story of a complete huckster, a man who is way past his prime and never really substantiated his story. I mean, me and Adrian Lloyd, who I don't know if he's still watching,
I
um,
saw him. Yep.
right? He, I mean, 45 minutes he wound the guy up, and spilled the beans to a newspaper that's been defunct for 11 years.
Mhm.
So you know, anyway,
But
I'd like.
I honestly don't think it's so much a lack of capability, or I think that it is outright propaganda.
Mhm.
And I think that that was intentional. And again, his association with David Brock really kind of snapped me into that. Oh my gosh, this was an actual officially um, officially organized narrative. You know, that it's an officially constructed narrative that they decided they were going to come out with in order to delegitimize the election of 2016 and also to start a war with Russia, which they've been itching to do now for many years. So I think that it kind of kills two birds with one stone for them. And I am deeply concerned because I know, as many other Americans know, that we often start wars based on completely false pretenses. And I think this is another one of those situations where some people are really trying to do that. And I think that's why there's a lot of frustration with Trump, because he is not part of the establishment. And even though they can get him to do certain things that they want him to do, there are other things that, for whatever reason, thank goodness, he doesn't. He, as they say, he doesn't stay on script. Thank God. So, I'd like to know who the script writers are and why any president, any democratically elected president, should be expected to follow a script. You know,
Right. Yeah. I don't know why.
who's coming up with the talking points,
I don't know why peace with North Korea can't fit into the script either.
right?
But yeah, it's been great talking to you, and we'll be in touch offline. And I'll see. I don't know yet about tomorrow with Josephine and Jim, because I'm kind of my schedule has changed, but we
Right.
did discuss it. But if we are able to work it out, we'll probably you know what, I'll create the chat tonight just so that people have the place available
Okay.
to, and I'll share it with them, and they'll probably share it to the group.
Okay.
Okay, so everybody, this was Joanne Allen from San Diego Bernie Kratz. I'm pleased to have had her as a guest on the show, and of course, we're still going to be discussing this even if nobody else is. So have a great night, and please like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment after it uploads. Goodbye.
Will do. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too, Joanne.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.